Follow along with me as I give our Santa Mickey inflatable an upgrade with the help of 3D printing. We have a 9-foot inflatable Santa Mickey that we set up in our yard for Christmas every year, and the neighborhood kids love it. Unfortunately, Mickey only made a brief appearance last year because his blower just seemed too worn out and wouldn't keep him upright, and I'm finally getting around to working on a solution. I will go ahead and warn you now, this project does involve some lightweight electrical work, and I'm not an electrician. So please proceed at your own risk, and if you're uncomfortable, just grab some popcorn and enjoy the show. First things first, we need to gain access to and remove the old fan. I know they're a necessary evil, but I hate these stupid latches. I removed the screws attaching the blower to the base, so now let's open it up and take a look. There are probably 2 wires that you'll need to cut. Somehow I didn't record myself actually cutting the wires, so you'll just have to use your imagination and pretend they are still connected while I use my imagination cutting the wires. Now that the wires are cut, there should be nothing keeping us from getting rid of the old blower. The newer blower is considerably larger in size than the old one, but it should work just fine. Famous last words, right? Because the intake on the new fan is larger, there's no chance of lining up the screw holes, so that's going to be a problem. Okay, time for a game plan. What do we do to solve this? Well, based on the clear acrylic ring attached to the blower when I first grabbed it, I had the same problem years ago, and clearly that solution wasn't great. But I didn't have a 3D printer back then either. Before we jump into Fusion, we need to get some measurements. First, I measured the base to get an idea of the spacing of the screw holes, which are about 100 millimeters apart from each other. Then I measured the width of the lip the blower sits on, or in our case, the adapter. To figure out the width of the opening, at first I figured I would measure the circumference of the outer edge, but I wasn't really happy with that. So instead, I employed my patent pending sweep from a fixed point approach to see where the circle was the widest. The intake fan had multiple screw holes, so I measured until I found 3 that were about equidistant from each other. I again employed my patent pending sweep measurement method to figure out the diameter of the widest ring on the fan grill. Okay, we have our measurements, so let's jump into Fusion. I'll admit, modeling didn't go as smooth as I had hoped because my first approach was way too overcomplicated. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of why the first approach was so bad. I first modeled out the base end, put all the screw holes in their place, then created an offset plane to use as my reference to create the blower end of the adapter. My thought was that I would just create a loft between the 2 ends and problem solve. And it probably could have been, except my Fusion skills are limited as I continue to learn, and I just couldn't make the loft happen the way I was expecting it to. Actually, I couldn't make it happen at all. After much deliberation on my life choices up to this point, I decided to take a step back and see how else I could approach this. The great thing about Fusion 360 is it has a ton of features included in the free version, and one of those features is called Revolve. What Revolve does is it takes a profile or a side view of something and rotates that around a fixed point to create a feature in the model. In my head, I know what the profile of the adapter should look like. It will have 2 flat areas at the top and bottom, where the blower and the base will attach respectively, and then it will need holes for the screws. I drew out the profile and put in the measurements I had taken earlier. I like using parameters anytime I think I might need to adjust a measurement later, because I can change them all in one place and not have to remember which sketch I put them in. To make sure my revolve has the right inner measurements, I just took half the diameter I measured before as my distance for the fixed point I'm going to revolve around. Once the profile was done, I ran the revolve, and presto, we have an adapter that's lacking screw holes, but I can work with this. Let's start with the fan end. The method I used for adding the screw holes was first I created a large circle, then created 3 smaller circles centered at points on the edge of that larger circle. My reasoning was that once I had in the distance between the hole centers, those holes will always move in a defined path while maintaining the appropriate distance. Trust me, I'll show you why this is important later. After a little more work, we now have screw holes on the blower end. I then flipped the model over and did the exact same thing for the base side of the adapter. All right, let's save it out as an STL and take it into our slicer software to create our test print. Anytime I'm working on a 3D model that needs to connect to something in the real world, I always do test prints that use as little filament as possible just to check the fit. In this case, I want to test fit the base opening size and hole placement to make sure it aligns correctly with the inflatable stand. I imported the model and added a negative volume object to control how much would print. I resized the negative volume and set it about 2 millimeters above the print bed, so that only the first 2 millimeters of the model would print. I sliced it and wait, over an hour to print? What is going on here? I'm using a 0.8 millimeter nozzle. I could cut and sandwich pieces of plastic together quicker than this by hand. After much adjusting and fiddling with no luck in reducing the print time, I actually paid attention to the stats in the top left where the time was being spent. Ironing. Once I turned that off, now we're down to 20 minutes. So I exported the G-code and sent it to the printer. I'm going to print this in ABS for the strength it offers. A few things to know about ABS. It needs a warm enclosure so it doesn't warp. Glue sticks also help it stick better to the bed and release easier. Because it can produce toxic fumes, the fumes need vented to the outside. And, drum roll please, it doesn't line up. The screw holes and the surrounding reinforcement aren't lining up on 2 of the 3 holes. I went back into Fusion to check my measurements, and as it turns out, I somehow missed adding the 3rd measurement between 2 of the holes. I have a feeling it was because when I was recording this, I forgot to record part of the modeling, so I created a new file to record that missing piece, and clearly I continued working in the wrong file later. Well, this is why we test things. Oh, remember earlier when I said having the screw holes on a circle would be important? While I was waiting for things to cool, I had some time to think. I didn't want the screw holes on the top and bottom aligned because that might make them difficult to screw in, but then it hit me. I'm going to have to come up with a way to screw the adapter to the fan from the outside of the adapter. After some reworking of the model, I made a pocket for the screws, but I also made it big enough for a screwdriver on the outside of the adapter. Now that I was happy with that, I exported it, sliced it, and sent another version of the base portion to the printer. I lined up our new test print, and the holes on the base match perfectly. Now that part's out of the way, let's do a test print of the fan portion of the adapter. To do that, I just flipped over the model in my slicer and sent it to print. Lining up the test print on the blower was tricky since I didn't bother to mark the holes I planned on using. After some spinning, I finally found the holes that lined up to the print. Not perfectly, and not nearly as good as the base, but that's okay, because I really just need this to hold the adapter to the fan, because the screws are going to bite into the plastic of the fan grill. With that in mind, I went back into Fusion and made a couple more tweaks to the hole size, and now we're good to go. When making a 3D model, you have to think about how it's going to print because 3D printers don't like printing in midair. Actually, they don't really care. They'll just do what you tell them to and assume you know what you're doing. A really poor assumption in my opinion. In my original model, I made flat flanges that stuck out on the top and the bottom. Unfortunately, that creates a situation where the printer would be printing in midair with no support.
You chose poorly.
Back in Fusion, I went in and tweaked my original profile and a couple of measurements to make it so the outside edge came up at an angle rather than just flat. This serves 2 purposes. It adds a little more heft to the connection point, but also gives the printer layers it can print on as it works its way up. Okay, time to print the complete model. I got rid of the negative volume object and reloaded the model just to make sure it was using the newest version. Everything looks good in the slicer, so time to send it to the printer. And now a few hours later, we have our custom 3D printed adapter. The print is done and looks pretty good. There's only this one little area in the screw holes, but I kind of expected it to mess up because, again, it was printing in midair. With the help of our beautifully 3D printed adapter, attaching the new blower to the base was a breeze. I lined up the holes on the adapter and attached it to the blower first, then sat the base on top and attached the base to the adapter. That all feels good and solid, so time to fix the wiring. I'm assuming if you made it this far, some light wiring isn't a concern, but if you're not comfortable with this part, then you should reach out to a friend, preferably one that you won't miss should something go wrong.
It was a joke.
All joking aside, always be careful when dealing with any kind of electricity and always treat every wire like it's live until you know otherwise. First, I ran the main power wire that I had cut earlier through the bottom so I could connect it to the blower. Before I make anything permanent, I like to make temporary connections and test things to make sure it still works. I connected the appropriate wires with wire nuts, plugged it in, and we have air movement and lots of noise, which I guess is the goal. Awesome. Now let's unplug the power and let's connect up the lights to the cord coming out of the blower using the same method. Since I wasn't paying attention, I let the wire to the lights slip down inside Mickey, so I had to go fishing to retrieve it. I hated to remove the connector coming out of the blower because it's actually a really nice, convenient touch, but I didn't have a matching one to attach to the lights, so it had to go. Testing all our connections again, we have lights and noise, so time to make the connections permanent. Since I'm just going to solder my wires, I place the silicone mat over Mickey to keep him safe from errant solder or flux. Yes, I'm wearing leather gloves to straighten the wires because removing stranded copper wire from under your skin is no fun. I'm going to use heat shrink to cover my connections, so I make sure to find a size that will easily slide over the wire and soldered connection. I'm also going to add some additional strength and protection by using a larger piece of heat shrink over both connections when they're done. Make sure to put your heat shrink on the wire and slide it down out of the way before you start soldering, because it will be more difficult to add it later if you forget. Once I've finished the two power connections, I plug it in and make sure things still work. We have air, we have noise, still good. I then do the same for the cords connecting the lighting and test again. With surgery complete, it's time to close up our patient. This is the easy part, or at least it should have been. I didn't think about the size and shape of the new blower versus the smaller zipper opening. After much struggling, I accepted the reality that I needed to unscrew the blower from the base, put everything inside the zipper, and then reattach the blower. And like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Mickey is reborn to delight kids for hopefully many more Christmas holidays. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you didn't, I hope you at least learned something from it. And if you didn't, then there's not much I can do for you other than say thanks for the YouTube watch time.